am here with Vedas Living, the Raw series, where real, authentic women talk about a variety of topics to help elevate other women. And some of the topics that we talk about deal with spiritual fulfillment, education revolving personal and well-being, and career and business development, and then health and wellness. And today I have a guest speaker on, and it is Cassandra Manna. And Cassandra is from BMD, which is Brennan Manna Diamond law firm, and she is an estate planning attorney. Cassandra, can you say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Like Tammy said, my name is Cassandra Manna. I am born and raised in Akron, Ohio, and have been living in Northeast Ohio pretty much all my life, except for a brief stint in Florida for law school and Columbus for college. Otherwise, I've been practicing for about 5.5 years now, and my practice focuses on estate planning, which Tammy and I will discuss in detail as this goes on. But tangentially to that, I also have experience in the corporate and real estate space, which tends to be beneficial for estate planning as well, as those are all related.
That's a pretty extensive history. Thank you for telling us about that. We had a conversation recently. It was so funny. The first time we met, we just totally hit it off. We were talking about all these things about elevating women. It was such a fun conversation, and we're doing some exciting things, both with your law firm and with Vedas Living. But one of the things when we were talking about what you do that really surprised me, especially in today's day and age, is that you have a lot of married couples who are coming in for estate planning, and the husband is doing the estate planning, but the wife is not really involved in that process. I was shocked by that. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it has to arise from a misconception about what estate planning is. Usually when you say estate planning or drafting a will or creating a trust, people are like, oh, that's for rich people. Or people with like white collar jobs that, I don't need that. And that's not the case. You don't have to be a millionaire to have an estate plan. You don't even have to be, a 500,000 heir to have an estate plan. So I think that sometimes people think, well, I'm the one with the business, or, my spouse doesn't need it because they're a stay-at-home parent. And it tends to lead to issues that just can be avoided if a couple jointly or adults individually, really do create an estate plan for themselves.
It doesn't even have to be just married couples. I mean, I'm a single mom, or I used to, my kids are grown now, but being a mom and having kids and having property and having money in the bank, having, retirement funds, all those sorts of things. If you own a car, if you own a business, you really should be thinking about this.
Absolutely.
For anyone. Yeah. That has a sort of legacy to send off to.
Yeah. And additionally, I mean, as parents, you should also be considering this stuff for your newly made adult kids that turn 18. People don't realize that maybe don't understand that, your kid turns 18, goes off to college. If they get sick and they're in the hospital and they don't have a power of attorney naming you as healthcare agent, the hospital can't tell you what's going on with your kid because they're an adult. So considering that stuff, even for your own children, let alone yourselves, is very important.
I didn't even think of that. You think that's my kid forever. I will have reign over decisions, unless they are married or something. But right. A very good point. Mm-hmm. So before we get any further, I think that we should clarify, what is estate planning exactly?
Yeah, that's a good idea. So estate planning is twofold. There's the pre-death planning, where you are considering what would happen to yourself and your stuff and any minor children if you were incapacitated for any reason. So you're in a coma and you're unable to make decisions for yourself, for your minor children, to pay your bills. You would want to create 3 separate documents: a healthcare power of attorney, a financial power of attorney, and a living will. Then the second part of estate planning is the after death planning. So what is going to happen to, again, all of your stuff and any minor children after you die? And to plan for that, every adult should have a will in place. And then depending on the type of assets you have, whether or not you have minor children or even young adult children, or the size of the assets you have, you would maybe want to create a trust. Again, trusts are not just for the super duper rich and wealthy. It's for people that have some money and they want it to go to different individuals in different amounts. If they have minor children, money can't go to a 10-year-old until they're 18. So what do you want to happen, or who do you want to care for that money from the age of 10 to 18 or beyond? So there's a lot more ways to use a trust to your advantage, and it's, again, not just for the super duper wealthy.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a few things, and so there's your will and then there's your living will. So maybe we should differentiate between that. And then also you talk about trusts, but then there's trusts and trust funds, right? The trustee who is responsible, and forgive me if I don't know the terms, this is your expert, you're the expert here. So if you could give us some clarity on that. What is the difference, and how do you make the decision on which way to go with your selection in your estate?
Yeah, so the difference between a will and a living will is the living will only applies while you are still alive. So what it is you have suffered some chronic illness, or you've been in an accident, and 2 separate physicians have determined that you are brain dead and there is no chance of recovery. You are basically indicating in that living will, do you want to continue on life-sustaining support, or do you want it removed? And part of that process is naming individuals that you would want to be present at the time that life-sustaining support is removed. So typically people name their spouse, their children. If they don't have a spouse or they don't have children, close siblings, parents, or, dear friends. It's something that's not a rush job. So if this were ever to occur to you, doctors are not just going to be like, yeah, she's brain dead. It's a very detailed process that's recorded, and, they give the family plenty of time to say their goodbyes before anything is done. On the flip side, a will only becomes applicable once you do die. And basically, it's a document that says, my name is Cassandra Manna, and I have a spouse, I have this many kids, or I don't have a spouse, I don't have kids, whatever it says. And here's what I want to happen to my house, my car, my bank accounts, the stuff in my house, so the books behind me, my glasses, my jewelry. You distribute that stuff in a way that you want. And it can be very simple. I want it all to go to my spouse, or I want it all to go equally to my kids, or, whatever you decide, you could give it to charity. But that also leads to the trust aspect. So you can, when your estate gets a little complicated, you have a lot of different assets, maybe you have a lot of different kids, some are minors, some are adults, or you just want your property to go in a variety of different ways. You want to create a trust because the trust document is private. A will is a public document. So that's the key. The real big plan around estate planning is to try to keep everything private, so that your nosy neighbors don't get online and go to the county website and see, oh, Tammy died, let's see how much money is going to her kids or to charity. Instead, you can file a will that says, my name's Cassandra Manna, I have a spouse, I have this many kids, I want all of my trust property, the books behind me, my jewelry, my house, my glasses, you know, my bank accounts, all that stuff to go to my trust. And then it ends there. And there's no other public information that's available for, you know, nosy people. Then the trust document itself is private. And that's where you can get into the nitty-gritty detail. You can say, you know, I want 20% to go to kid number 1 and 80% to go to kid number 2. Or I want it to go equally to all my kids, but, you know, one of my kids has a substance abuse problem. I want to make sure she doesn't squander the money. So here are, you know, things that are put in place to make sure that she only gets the money when she's clean. You can put a lot of detail, a lot of thought. You can put in information about what you want your legacy to be in there. You know, you can put in terms and language that I want this to go to charity because this certain organization was near and dear to my heart, or I want to create a scholarship foundation for my high school I graduated from to help other children go to college or whatever. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and it allows you to really make a difference after your death with your assets. But again, it's private, so nobody who's nosy and maybe people you don't want to know can't figure out that information.
Okay, great. So there's a few different points that you brought up there that kind of got my brain cooking a little bit with more questions. You brought up the fact of privacy. I think that, you know, people don't really make that consideration that their entire life and all of their earnings, and it just becomes public. And so with the right planning, you can prevent that from happening, because who wants that sort of vulnerability, not only for yourself, even after death, but for your family. You don't want them to have that kind of people to know things about them that are very personal, especially during a really challenging time. They're dealing with a lot of stuff. The other thing that you mentioned is some of the decisions that you make or you don't make can have these financial implications. So you had mentioned, you know, a living will. A living will, you know, if you're brain dead, your living will may state that you're on life support for an X amount of time or until something happens, or it might say, give me 3 days and then cut it off because there's no reason why my family should pay for the medical bills related to that, or that any of my estate go towards that. It makes me think that there are probably a lot of other decisions like that, where if you don't kind of plan that out ahead of time, that decision for your family may be so difficult that they make a choice when they're emotionally charged and distraught that could really impact how your estate could be helpful in their life moving forward. So as an example, if you stay on life support, you know, that money's going to come from somewhere. So I assume that there are probably some other ways that can be impacted too. Again, like if you don't do any estate planning and the state gets involved, I've heard that there are a lot of fees and where some of your estate funds can go to the state. Can you explain more of those types of implications that can happen when you don't do estate planning?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you don't do estate planning and you have some assets, whether it's just a couple bank accounts or it's a car or a house, or it's even more complicated, like you own a business and say you're really into collecting art and you've got some fancy paintings in your house or anything like that. In order for it to legally go to your spouse or your children or whomever would be the next people in line to get your stuff, if there's no estate plan in place, meaning there's no will, the state has to get involved. So what would happen is you would whatever county you died in, or were a resident in, you would file with that probate court and you would say, hi, you know, Cassandra Manna died, and she has a bunch of stuff and, you know, we couldn't find a will. What are the next steps? And the court starts getting involved and they have to, you know, find out if there's any heirs, meaning descendants. Is there a living spouse alive? So there's a lot of filings that have to occur, paperwork that needs to be signed, court fees that need to be paid. And eventually they need to find someone to act in a fiduciary capacity, meaning someone to step up and be like, I will represent Cassandra Manna after her death. And typically that's someone that's named in your will. But if it's not, they'll ask the spouse if he or she are surviving, and then they'll ask the adult children, and then they start asking, extended family from there.
Like a next of kin sort of thing.
Right. But the thing is, it's just a slow process. I mean, we've all had interactions with court systems or the government in general, and it just takes time. It costs money, and that money comes from the estate itself. So again, Cassandra Manna has died. We're doing all of this. My bank accounts will end up paying these court fees and these filings and this time and all that, but that means that's less money off the top that will end up going to whomever's inheriting my stuff. So a way to limit that is to plan, and by creating a will, you can expedite a lot of that process. Sometimes you still need to file with the court, but it's much, much more expedited because there's a will that says, I want this person to represent me after death. I want these people to inherit my stuff. Mm-hmm. So the courts are not involved as much, and the fees are very minimal.
And the attorney who has done this state of planning is involved in that process after death. Right. So you have that go-to person that's already built a relationship with your family member or friend or spouse or whoever that might be, and they have a deeper understanding of this is, what was desired, and then you will kind of manage that to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think, and again, this is any adult, but women typically, this seems to be more effective at pulling at their heartstrings, but like we do things to make the lives of those we love easier. Mm-hmm. And, as a parent, I'm sure what you do is to make your children's lives easier. If you estate plan, you are making the lives of those you love easier at the time of death. They're grieving, and the last thing people want to do while they're grieving is like sit and talk to a lawyer and try to figure out what the heck is going on, and going through all this paperwork and trying to find passwords to log into a computer and dealing with the court system and paying, debts if needed, or trying to sell a home and all that stuff. That's unnecessary stress you can relieve your loved ones from by planning it and being like, this is what's going to happen. So they can kind of just coast along as it occurs with the attorney, assisting along the way.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. And I imagine that some people make decisions in the moment because they feel pressured to make these decisions. They're not quite sure. They're overwhelmed. And maybe in hindsight, they look back and think, oh, I could have made a different decision. So you release your family from those stressors afterward when you really take the time to plan ahead. And it's a tough decision to plan ahead. During our conversation, you had mentioned like nobody really wants to talk about their own death. That's kind of a scary thing in itself.
Right.
Do you have any stories for the viewers on, that include an example of like how wrong things really can go when you don't estate plan, or you don't plan well? Like say you find an attorney and they just didn't really understand your wishes fully and it wasn't fleshed out. And then also maybe an example on the other side of that, somebody who really planned things out and there were some hidden gems in that story where afterward, the family was just so happy that all of this had been done.
Yeah, I guess we'll start with the bad situations first. There's two things that always come to mind when people are like, do I estate plan or not? And one is to consider your relationship situations. So if you're a divorcee, or you have stepchildren, or your spouse, and you are in the process of divorcing, you know, things like that. Sometimes if you die without an estate plan, money can go to people that you don't want it to go to. If you don't have an estate plan, basically what the law says is if there's no estate plan, you know, your money and your stuff is going to go in this certain order to these certain people. So making sure you plan that way, especially when you have a blended family, allows for you to make sure, you know, hey, my money is not going to go to my second husband's adult children who I don't know and have never met or maybe don't have a good relationship with. They're going to go to my, you know, direct children only. If you don't plan, that can be an issue. And another thing to think about is a lot of women and men out there, you know, you're involved in a company, you either run your own company, say Vegas Living, or, you know, you have a side hustle of some kind, you know, whether you're selling some products or, you know, you have the stuff that's in your name. And I've seen where people that are business owners don't create an estate plan because they're so busy. They're wearing a ton of different hats on top of being, you know, parent, you know, an adult individual who has a social life. So estate planning is tomorrow, and it's the last thing on their mind. And I've seen where a business owner has died without an estate plan. And what happens is that business information becomes public because you have to involve the courts to get it settled where that money's going to go and where that interest in the business is going to go. So your business partners actually have a stake in whether you have an estate plan or not. Because although only your part would be public, you know, through the county and stuff, people can use their heads. And so if, you know, Tammy, you and I are in business together 50-50, and I die and I don't have an estate plan, and, you know, the paperwork comes out, it's published online, you know, newspapers, nosy neighbors can look at it and say, oh, Cassandra's 50% owner of, you know, XYZ company, and she has $1 million that needs to be distributed. Well, they can assume that you, the other 50% owner, also have $1 million. Wow. Now that takes some legwork, and, you know, that takes some, you know, journalism or investigating, whatever you want to call it. But that people usually want to keep private.
But people do. I mean, that's a good point to bring up. I never knew that. And you know, you hear about widows getting taken advantage of because their husbands die, and then all of a sudden, you know, this, for lack of a better term, gigolo, or what, the old term,
a Casanova
pops into their life, right? Casanova, and take interest in her, and she's in the middle of this grieving process. And if that information wasn't public, and not only women, but this happens to grieving, you know, husbands or siblings or whoever, you're placed in a position where you're not your strongest self sometimes because you are dealing with this stress, and people can and will look for that and take advantage of you. And so there's another layer of protection to your family that you're providing by making sure that you're planning all of this. And your partners, I don't think your partners would be very happy that all this information all of a sudden became public.
No, definitely not. And another thing is also, if you don't plan and you, again, have minor children and this money is going to them, it's not great for them, you know, at 15 to have just lost a parent and have to deal with, you know, nosy neighbors or parents of their friends looking up how much they're worth now. Again, you know, it's not the end of the world, but it just makes things easier for people in the long run if you do this planning.
Right. So I think the next apparent question, you've made such a good argument that we should do this. So, I think, one is, do you have your estate planned well, or do you only have pieces to this? And if you're looking to then find somebody, like, what are some of the things you want to look for in an attorney? Because we've all had that attorney that we didn't really like very much. We've all had that doctor we didn't like, that trainer we didn't like. It doesn't matter, what profession it is. We found people that we just wish we had more information to be able to vet better. So what are some vetting questions that we can leave people with as they're making this search?
Yeah, first and foremost, you want to make sure that whoever is your estate planning attorney is someone that you really, really feel comfortable talking about some very serious issues with. Myself, I'm an attorney, but I also feel like a therapist sometimes. I mean, people are coming in and talking about, my spouse is sick and they've got, so much time to live. What do we need to do? Or I've got a kid that's addicted to, drugs, and I want to make sure they're cared of, but I don't want them to squander the money. I mean, this is tough stuff to talk about, and you need to be able to feel comfortable saying all of that to your attorney, because they can plan and help you plan the best if they know everything. Mm-hmm. So the first, if you don't feel comfortable talking to them, or they speak to you in a condescending way, or they just make you uncomfortable for any reason, never feel like you have to hire an attorney. Like, even if I'm going to hire you and then you're like, wait a minute, you can change your mind.
Well, and I think with attorneys, to your point, if you ever had a lawsuit, you want an attorney that can really stand strong in court against somebody when you're in that situation. And maybe that they're not the most empathetic person, and that might be okay for that particular situation. So it sounds like what you're saying is, in this situation, it's very vulnerable. You really want to be talking to somebody who is empathetic, understanding, like you said, not condescending, but can help you flush out the decisions that you have to make in your preparation process, but also that can be sensitive enough that there are going to be emotional moments during this planning process that you feel like they're not, looking down at you or judging you for that.
Right. I mean, yeah, people tend to come in and they'll say stuff like, we've got one kid that has one issue, and, they're embarrassed to talk about it. And I mean, every family has their issues, and it's usually issues, plural, not one issue. So you're usually doing pretty good if you only have one problem in the family. But yeah, I mean, like you said, these are tough topics. You need an attorney that will be empathetic, but at the same time will be like, okay, these are decisions that you need to make, and my recommendation is this, considering that, so someone that knows their stuff, but someone who's patient and, willing to talk to you about this stuff. And it just explains what they are. I mean, these documents, people who are not estate planning attorneys don't, use these documents unless their parent or their spouse dies. So it's usually, maybe once to 3 or 4 times in your lifetime that you actually interact with these documents. So they're complicated, they're legal documents, but an attorney can break them down and should be able to break it down and make it understandable for you, so you understand all the moving parts and how they work together.
Okay. What are the typical fees associated with estate planning? And is that based upon like how many assets you have, I would assume? Is it based upon like, what's the criteria for that range?
Yeah, it depends on the attorney, whether they do a flat fee for their services or if they do an hourly rate. It just depends on the law firm and the attorney in it. For me, what we do at BMD is tend to do a flat fee for what we call a basic estate plan. And a basic estate plan is what we recommend every single adult has. It's a will, a healthcare power of attorney, a financial power of attorney, and a living will. So it's 4 documents. You know, I know how to make those. They're simple, you know, they're direct. Everything's going to my spouse or everything's going to my kids. I don't have much, but you know, I want to make sure it's handled. As things get more complicated, so the trusts are definitely, you know, complicated documents. They're long, they're lengthy. Depending on the complexity, again, of the estate, I can sometimes do a flat fee for them. Other times, you know, it's at an hourly rate because there's going to be multiple trusts we're drafting, and we're doing different types of trusts depending on your tax planning considerations. But that usually occurs when you've got a larger estate, you've got a ton of investments or business ventures that you need to consider. So it just, again, depends on the attorney that, you know, you're talking to. But that's something you can ask them right away when you're interviewing. I mean, I would recommend people don't hesitate to interview an attorney. You can reach out to a law firm and say, hey, can I stop in for 15, 20 minutes to meet you? I'm thinking about creating an estate plan. And if they're not willing to meet with you beforehand, you know, maybe that just means that their capacity is at a limit and they really can't take on your work. But most attorneys will make time to meet you and get to know you so that you can feel comfortable with them, hopefully. And then explain their process. Then you can ask them about their fee service or their fee structure at that time.
Okay, great. So there's a range and you have to figure that out with each attorney because they're a little bit different.
Exactly.
And you've mentioned that there are a variety of different documents that you need. And we talked about finding an attorney and then kind of vetting that attorney and then understanding the fee structure before you get started. What are the steps, whether it's preparational, like what documents will you need to have when you first meet with an attorney, once you've made the selection? What are the steps from preparation all the way up to completion that one can anticipate in this process, and maybe even the length of time that it might take to complete a process like this?
Yeah, definitely. So once you find an attorney you feel comfortable moving forward with, usually how I handle my clients is I either do, depending on where they are, I do a phone call with them or a video conference, or if we can meet in person, I like to meet in person and just kind of chat. We talk about, you know, they explain if they've got a spouse, if they've got kids, you know, just kind of get to know each other a little bit. And just based on that initial conversation, I'm able to say, just based on what we talked about, you know, I could see you needing this to happen. And this always includes those 4 basic documents I talked about earlier. But at that point, I'm able to say, you know, you don't really need a trust. We can plan around a trust. Or you do need a trust, and here's why. At that point, I usually give them what I call an estate planning questionnaire, and it's just a couple document that they can handwrite or they can type into and fill out, and it's just provides name, phone number, address, contact information, date of birth, and then starts asking you questions. Do you have any bank accounts? Are they checking or savings? Do you have any investment accounts? Do you have a Roth IRA? Do you have a 401k? How much are in those bank accounts? Where are they located? Do you have an accountant? Have you been filing your taxes? Do you have any real estate property you own? Business property you own? You know, do you have a mortgage? Any outstanding debt? You know, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly get you or you and your spouse thinking, okay, what do I have? I mean, we all, every new job, we fill out a new paperwork for, you know, a retirement plan, and you sometimes just forget what you have. So these
Forget. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot going on.
Forget these things because they're there for a while. You just, whatever, you can put money in there. You're like, oh, I bought that property, or I forgot all about that. It's kind of a nice little surprise.
Exactly. So this questionnaire is just trying to get you to trigger those thoughts in your head so you have a better understanding of what you do have, assets and liability wise, and you give that information to me, and it helps me get a plan better for you. A lot of those assets are, I mean, we have been talking about the probate system, and we have been talking about creating this will and creating, you know, trust documents. But there are a lot of assets out there that are not governed by the probate court or by wills and trusts. So for example, your 401k, if you think back to when you filled that out, it asked you to designate a beneficiary. And what that means is the person you listed on there will receive that money outside of probate, outside of what your will says. So if you designate beneficiaries in these situations, they're going to go to those people regardless if you say that in your will or not. So you have to make sure you know who your beneficiary designation is and you update that as needed. But at that point, once you've filled out that form, a couple other questions that are asked are, where do you want your stuff to go at death? Who do you want to serve as guardian of your children? Who would you want to be executor of your estate, which is that person that represents you at court after your death? Who do you want to be trustee of your trust, which is, again, that person that acts on your behalf for distributing the trust and following the directions you put in there. And then I need contact information for those people. So once you've filled that all out and you send it to me, just depending, again, on the complexity level, it can be, I've had people say, like, call me and be like, my mom's dying. It's going to happen any day and she doesn't have a will. Can you get me something tomorrow? And I've pulled a late night and I've been able to do it. I don't recommend that being the process. I recommend you planning all this way beforehand, but sometimes emergencies happen. But probably from beginning to end, it could be a month to 6 weeks. Just once you get the information to your attorney, and then they can sit down and draft everything. Then they'll send it to you to review. Hey, is everything accurate? Do you have any questions? And then you come in and you sign everything and you're good to go. You don't really have to think about it again for another 3 to 5 years. We just recommend people think about their estate plan, again, every 3 to 5 years, because the laws change, things in your life.
Right.
So you might need to edit that stuff.
You get mad at your sister for some reason,
Exactly.
She's out.
And I've had clients
very good
that,
friends
yeah, I've had clients that every quarter are like, take my sister out, and then they're like, oh, I'll leave it to my sister, and then no, it's been back and forth many times. It happens, but you can put it out of your mind, except
right.
Reconvening every 3 to 5 years.
So find your attorney. You're going to have to get some paperwork in order. That's going to take some time and compile what are all of your assets, all the way down to those little things like the rings or jewelry that you wear that maybe you don't even think about, cuff links, that sort of thing. And then you'll plan with your attorney. You'll fill out all the documentation. You'll spend some time fleshing that out. And then when you're done, that's pretty much it, except for as things change, as your assets grow, as you buy more property, as maybe, something happens within your family, maybe there's a death in your family, maybe there's a new birth in your family, then you'll kind of revisit and you'll make those changes along the way. It sounds like a pretty easy process. It's just a couple-step process, but there's some preparation involved. And you're going to have that information when you're ready to go to the attorney. But the attorney is going to help to flesh that out and remind you what information you need.
Yeah, and I want to stress about having information before you go meet the attorney. Like once you've decided what attorney you want, I want to stress about having that information ready to go off the bat. Expected to know everything that we would need to create the estate plan for you. And that's why, I like the questionnaire. It's a single hard document that people can really work their way through. And it's all in one place versus being like, she said I needed this, and there was an email about this, and then I can ask for detailed information as needed. One thing just to consider, most people this doesn't apply to at the moment, but currently there's no federal estate tax because the limit is 11.3 something million dollars you have to have as an individual or the 22, whatever that is, double if you have a spouse, in order to even be taxed. So most people don't, you know, cross that threshold. But if you are above that threshold, you know, another aspect of estate planning is tax planning. How to limit how much of my money is going to be paid to the federal government. And that's where you would want your accountant to be involved with the planning that you do with your attorney. So I work a lot with accountants that are like, here's what's going on, here's what we think we need, you know, and I draft accordingly. The other thing to keep in mind is, to get political, but depending on how the election goes in November, could really indicate what's going to happen with that estate threshold. So is the tax level going to remain up at that 11.2 million? Or is it going to bump back down when it expires in a couple years to the 5, 6 that it was before, or even further down to 3 or 1 million? That increases the number of people it applies to at that point. For anyone that's listening that maybe has concerns about that, that's another aspect you want to ask, you know, the attorney about, and make sure to loop in your accountant when that situation arises.
That's a good point. That's a good point. We don't really think about the implications of that, taxes and how that plays a role. I mean, obviously there's the financial connection there, but when we think estate, we think it's almost compartmentalized from things like taxes.
Right, right. But taxes are involved in everything.
Death and taxes, that's what they always say. You gotta bring Well, this has been really informative. I know that I have to kind of revisit this myself, so I'll be giving you a call here shortly.
Great, great.
How do people get a hold of you? What's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, if you ever go to BMD's website, you'll, be able to find the different attorneys, and you can click on my page. It's got my contact information there. I'm very responsive to either emails or phone calls, whatever you prefer. So whatever you're most comfortable with. And, we can schedule meetings or calls from there and get started on your estate plan.
Great. Well, thank you, Cassandra. We are so happy that you joined us today. I'll make sure that all of your links are available wherever we post the video. We'll have your email and your phone number in the newsletter that goes out. Don't forget to like our channel, Aveda's Living, on YouTube, and then like us on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter. And you can reach out to me if you have any questions and you'd like to get a hold of Cassandra or anyone else that we have on the show. Thank you for joining us, and have a good day.
Thanks, Tammy. This was great.